Hello and welcome to class.
So can everyone say hi to Madeline?
Hi,
Madeline.
Hi, Bob.
Hello.
Can everyone say hi to Bob?
Hey, Bob.
Fantastic. I want to start by hearing, and I know not everyone got to this, which is fine, but if you did get to it, can you just, in no particular order, say the end of your sentence? So crime and punishment is about...
The Ubermensch theory and how people can accept it or not accept it.
Okay, great, thanks.
Stepping over different types of boundaries.
The legitimacy/illegitimacy of the Ubermensch theory.
Thank you. The moral and societal transgressions people perpetrate and the hubris of Rodin's belief in his own moral superiority.
A crime and whether it can be moral or not.
The issues when the human psyche travels outside of societal norms.
The ability to for paranoia and guilt to creep into day-to-day life and suffocate the victim.
The descent into madness.
About how once crossed, ethical thresholds cannot be uncrossed.
The idea of expected purpose and the freedom someone has to accept or prevent it.
The emotional limits a person can reach before they snap.
Weighing needs and desires against morals and consequences.
The legal, moral, and personal repercussions of crossing a boundary.
Anyone else? Great. So I'm going to refer to this document you have in front of you a lot as a kind of a backbone to this discussion. But I don't want it to turn into a monologue that I'm going to deliver for the next 35 minutes. There's a lot of stuff here. I'm spending my own kind of evolution in, first underlining or sticky noting, the second or third time I read, maybe adding to that, third or fourth time I read, maybe writing down some notes, and every year that I go back to it, kind of rethinking what I have and how it makes sense. And that certainly seems to kind of evolve. But we can start with this first one. Dostoevsky writes of the novel, I think, while he was writing it, in a letter to Mikhail Kepkov, who was a Russian journalist at the time. Dostoevsky wrote, "It is a psychological account of a crime. Insoluble problems arise for the murderer. Unsuspected and unexpected feelings torment his heart. The truth of God and the law of the earth take their toll. And he ends by being forced to denounce himself, forced even if he should perish in jail, to rejoin people. The feelings of isolation and separation from mankind, which he felt as soon as he committed the crime, wore him down. The law of truth and human nature took its toll. The criminal himself decides to accept torments in order to redeem his act, but it is difficult for me to clarify fully my idea. Besides this, my story makes allusions to the idea that the punishment meted out by law to the criminal deters the criminal far less than the lawgivers think, because he himself demands it morally." My decision to kind of italicize and boldface to rejoin people, but it is something that comes up, and even in part one, he seems unnaturally and maybe even unknowingly drawn toward people, and I think it's a motif throughout, and it's one that he is in conscious conflict of, as he thinks he is above people. Ultimately, he thinks he is better than most, or at least among a select few who, with that title of Ubermensch, would be above others. And then there's this one quote, even from page 11, was the first time I noticed it, rereading it for today, about Raskolnikov and crowds. Raskolnikov was not used to crowds, and as has already been mentioned, fled all company, especially of late. But now something suddenly drew him to people. Something new was happening in him, as it were, and with that, a certain thirst for people made itself felt. So, both interesting to pay attention to the repulsion of people at the same time as the attraction to people, because those are both kind of speaking the same. I had put up on the board to talk about a quick bio on Dostoevsky. I feel like it kind of sticks out, so I'm going to skip over it. If we have time, we'll do it at the end. If not, maybe another day. I tried to just quickly list major plot points for part 1, and did this literally in like less than 5 minutes this morning, but just thinking like, okay, so if we want to go back to the text and find any of this, where can we go? Right, so he's wandering at first, he meets Marmeladov, he finally arrives in his own room, he gets that long letter from his mother, he runs into that girl, runs into the girl in the, park, tries to save her. He has this horrible dream of the mayor. He awakes from the dream and is drawn to the market. I mean, we could get into that analytically, but I think he wakes up from that pretty horrific dream and is drawn to people. He has a second and probably the least important dream of the novel, but it's at least something to note that he thinks he's in Africa, in Egypt, in some oasis, almost like he's not sure. By page 69, the murder has been thought about, but now it's in motion. He leaves to murder Aliona. And he experiences a certain fear after murdering Lizaveta, who was not part of his plan. And by page 86, in the end of part 1, he barely arrives back into his room after safely putting the axe back in the caretaker's closet. This whole idea about laws versus morality, there's an interesting and kind of, well, I think it's initially very cheesy, but it's kind of an interesting tagline on a crime and punishment poster for a movie that came out 10 or 15 years ago. And it talks about the difference of all the things in this novel it could talk about. The tagline identifies a difference between the first and the second murder. And it says the first murder was a crime, and the second murder was a sin. It's interesting to think about. I mean, if this story is a test of whether the Übermensch theory is a possibility, does that conversation get messed up now thinking that Raskolnikov had this plan and this right he felt to kill Aliona? But he never felt that way about Lizaveta. Lizaveta was just kind of an innocent bystander. And it was at that moment, I wrote on page 79, our experiences fear after Lizaveta's murder. And in quick and direct juxtaposition from descriptions of him not having any fear at all over the death of Aliona, that he almost moved just mechanically with no fear, some of what the narration says. And soon thereafter, on page 80, there's this long scene about, blood just staining everything and him trying to clean it. And very reminiscent for me to probably arguably the most famous kind of washing blood scene in all of Western literature is probably from Macbeth. And when he can't wash the deeds from his mind, and kind of symbolized through him not being able to wash his hands. And his wife makes fun of him for that at that point. Any thoughts or questions so far?
I have one question about the murder scene. The first time when he kills Aliona, does he use the backside of the axe and then he switches it when he kills Lizaveta? Mm-hmm. Is that how it was? I wasn't completely certain on how that went down.
Honestly, I don't really remember.
Yeah, I think he uses the blunt side for the first murder, and then he uses the sharp side for the
Okay, alright, I just didn't
maybe, just practically with more blood.
Okay, yeah, I just didn't pick that up. I wanted some clarification.
Mm-hmm. No, good point. There's this term I gave you over the summer, in medias res, thinking of something that's often it's thought of as an action point. You enter into a novel and plot-wise, a high point of action. And we don't quite get that, but we do get Raskolnikov, who has already been thinking about this murder. Even if you look in your books on the bottom of page 3, which I think is the very first page, he says, I want to attempt such a thing, and at the same time, I'm afraid of such trifles. Now, when you read this, you probably had no idea, and rightfully so, what he's talking about, but he's talking about this murder. It's on his mind already. It's interesting that thing in here is not italicized only because quite often what happens later on in this part is that the idea of the person or the act is kind of put into a pronoun. Thank you. Great. Thanks. And so he'll think about, he'll say things like that. That he's thinking about the murder. It's in italics. It is also still hard to pick up on, not having read this book before. Did anyone notice some of those pronouns in there?
Sometimes it does it would italicize it and then do like ... Then it would kind of pick up a new train of thought on a totally different idea. And first couple chapters I didn't really know what that was, but it was definitely noticeable.
So like he can't even. It's interesting. I mean, if you look at if you look at the top of page 4 in that first paragraph, or it starts in the middle of the paragraph, but in that one, 3 lines up, right above the word "like," which is the last word in the paragraph. 2 lines up from that, you see the word "that" in italics. He's thinking about the murder. Am I really capable of that? Is that something serious? I'm not serious at all. I'm just toying with it for the sake of fantasy, a plaything. Here's a plaything, if you like. He can't even, in his own thinking that we get, I guess, quoted here, he can't say what he's about to do, which is interesting, because if you looked at him as this Übermensch, you'd say, well, he never quite had that ability. He was always being affected by this. He can't address exactly what he's going to do. And if he just kind of downplays it and said, oh no, it's not really a thought, it's just this idea, this fantasy. And it pops up in here a number of times during the course of part 1. There's a lot of things established in the first couple pages, even just between page 3, 4, and 5. On page 4, in the very next paragraph, you get this horrible description of this place that he's in, which is St. Petersburg. And it's often thought of this beautiful place with just riches, gardens and palaces, gilded. And what do we get? It was terrible, terribly hot out, and moreover it was close, crowded, lime, scaffolding, bricks, dust everywhere, and that special summer stench known so very well to every Petersburger who cannot afford to rent a summer house. All at once, these things unpleasantly shook the young man's already overwrought nerves. And this idea of Petersburg as the stinking city is pretty important to the novel, and it's very oppressive. And it almost has this feeling that it breeds that stench, that oppression breeds that in other people like Raskolnikov. It is also, St. Petersburg was a very curt example of the haves and have-nots, and in a city that was so geographically in parts and islands connected by bridges, it was very easy to have the well-to-do part, and very easy to totally isolate off the very destitute and poor. So much of Petersburg in the mid-1800s, 1840s, it looks like that. That the streets are so very different from one another. And that's the stinking city, that idea of it as this force in this novel, is certainly something to consider. And it's probably no surprise that Raskolnikov is a dynamic character as our main character, and if he is going to have a transformation in this novel away from this person who murders in part 1, we should consider if it's even possible in the city of St. Petersburg, because of the force that it continues to be through the narration. The next thing up on the second page is looks at suffering. Does anyone you notice the word come up? You notice examples come up? In the text?
Well,
Marmoladev certainly seems to suffer,
Yeah.
and kind of by his own doing.
Yeah. And is understanding of his daughter as one who suffers kind of makes him suffer all the more.
And Raskolnikov's sister seems to also suffer on his behalf as well.
Yeah.
And Marmeladov also says, I thirst not for joy, but for sorrow and tears. So he really drawn to suffering.
Yeah, that's great. There's a couple things here. What are the examples of suffering? But then there's this whole other thing about people I wrote up there, fated to suffer, like kind of drawn to suffering in some very kind of bizarre way. Luke?
Yeah, you can also argue that Sonia is kind of fated to suffering in that she is a prostitute and she doesn't really think much of it and not enjoys it, but she doesn't really fight her stepmom when she's asked to take the job.
Yeah. Nice stepmom. Yeah, and as we get to know her more and meet her kind of in the novel rather than hear about her, she's an interesting one to consider. What she does and how does it affect her psychologically and morally. Anything else? I think I talked about this a little bit when I talked about this theme last time, but if you look at this discussion about Russian Orthodox Christianity, it kind of talks about the role of suffering. So it says traditional Orthodox life is also a life of suffering love, and this is the most difficult for North Americans to accept. Even though we are familiar with suffering, we do all that we can to avoid it. The Lord said that if we were to follow him, we have to take up our cross. The cross cannot be embraced without suffering. A non-suffering Orthodox Christian is a contradiction of terms. A non-suffering Orthodox Christian is on the road to hell. As an example of Russian Orthodox Christian explaining themselves to others. And if Raskolnikov is a non-believer, but there's this overcast of that everyone should become one in some way, it's interesting to think of the role of fate or things beyond his control that would pull him into a place to suffer. And in that way, it kind of dovetails pretty well into the next one, pitting worlds against each other. We see this in all kinds of ways. The rich and the poor, I've already talked about. Believers and non-believers. Raskolnikov's own struggle with his consciousness and subconsciousness. There's some discussion about one of the themes up there is talks about academia versus kind of a spirituality and morality, and kind of those tugging at each other. And certainly divergent views on the Ubermensch theory and whether that's a possibility versus somebody said, no, we're all contractually kind of morally bound somehow.
On page 14,
Yep.
Marmeladov brings up this guy, Mr. Lebzhatnikov, I don't know how to pronounce it.
Lebzhatnikov, I think, but something.
But he says, that guy says that in our time, compassion is even forbidden by science, as is already happening in England. And I just thought that was an example of the kind of contrast of academia and morality.
Yeah, that's good. He comes back. I kind of forgot that he was mentioned here until I was rereading this in the last couple of days. He comes back later on in the novel. He does live, so we can think about geographics here. This is somebody who shares the apartment building with the Marmeladovs. He lives in maybe an adjacent apartment or went up the stairs, I think, but right nearby, and that's how there's a connection with Semyon Marmeladov in this, as he talks about in this tavern. Yeah.
One thing that I think connects both into what we were just talking about and the suffering is at the end of the letter that Raskolnikov's mother sends. She says, "I hope you're still praying," or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And we know that he's not, and yet so it's pitting against the worlds of his mother, who's religious and suffering for him, versus Raskolnikov, who's not religious and suffering, I guess, in different ways, but not quite for the religion.
Yeah, the direct line here is, do you pray to God, Radia, as you used to, and do you believe in the goodness of our Creator and Redeemer? I fear in my heart that you have been visited by the fashionable new unbelief. So this idea of the unbelievers being this kind of new entity kind of invading Mother Russia is certainly part of this novel, and how it kind of is not something that many people are embracing in quite kind of illegal ways sometimes.
Do we know whether the writer of this book was a non-believer or was he a devout?
Like a rebirth.
Both. The quick bio I was going to give talks about him being in his 20s very much an academic, very much pushing God aside, a non-believer of sorts, meeting with other folks like-minded, even though that was very illegal in 1940 or 1840s Russia. They had a nickname of, I think, the Petrovsky Circle, and at some meeting they were rounded up and arrested and sentenced to be executed. And he has this crazy, I mean, this is his real life. It's not the novel, the made-up stuff. Him and his folks are sitting in front of a firing squad, ready to be executed. And a messenger arrives from the Tsar, and it's very uncertain as to why, but their sentences were all changed from death by firing squad to hard labor in Siberia, where, ironically, the only thing that they're allowed to read is the New Testament. And so he works there for a few years, and he somehow finds religion. And he leaves, and he, for all intents and purposes, comes out a very changed man. And not too long after he's out, he writes this novel. He published it serially, so he wrote it in parts and published it in a magazine. And I think, while by the time we get to the end of the novel, it might align more with his beliefs at that point in his life, I think he certainly still gives due process to some other ideas. And what you couldn't publish in Russia at this time was an explicit journal article about morality or about the Superman theory. There's no way you could do that without being, probably sentenced to death, if not put in jail. But what literature is notoriously known for is a way to kind of hide those conversations and to be kind of this all-encompassing kind of mega story in which you can kind of insert, a textbook about psychology, a textbook about the subconscious, a textbook about morality, and that's what this seems to be. I mean, even right before the mayor dream, there's this very bizarre paragraph that it looks like it's like lifted out of a psychology textbook about how to read and interpret dreams, and then we got this crazy dream of his. Yeah, Nathan?
I find it interesting that it's a student who says, I could kill and rob that cursed old woman, talking about Elizaveta, and I assure you without any remorse. Why a student? To kind of juxtapose, morality and, academics. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think this force of the unbeliever, the non-believer, or the academics was thought of as just totally divergent and incompatible with religion. So if you were of a student's mindset, you were also kind of the devil's as well, so to speak. It's kind of pretty bizarre. Let's see. Crimes and punishments, I talked about that as a theme, but we should continue to consider that. So what are the crimes in the novel? What are the punishments in the novel? And what are the laws that seem to govern them. Right? So legally speaking, Sonia is not breaking any laws. But so if you applied this question to her, what crimes is she breaking?
Selling herself. Right.
What crime? That's what she's doing. But what crimes? What laws are she breaking? If you look at that, the word law is a figurative concept.
You think about like the church and the idea of like kind of the like puritanical like anti-sex society that comes from like Christianity. Then you think that like spiritually she would be committing like I guess a sin by doing that, but also like she's not very much at fault for her situation as much as like her parents who kind of brought her to that, and she's really just trying to support them.
Yeah,
I guess.
Yeah, I mean, think about her situation. It's her father, biological father. By all means, it seems to be just a drunk and on the outs with his family. The family who lives together mostly is his biological daughter Sonia, his new wife Katerina, who's dying of tuberculosis. If we remember Thomas Foster talking about diseases, tuberculosis is one of those. He talks about these things as being, I think he talks about it being like these like wispy, like, I think he even uses the word sexy, like diseases, and it's like bizarre to think that way. But it's like, it's romantic in the fact that like, it's it's ultimately doomed at some point. Like, you know, somebody with tuberculosis in the 1840s is going to die. If you know anything about the disease, you'd know that it will start to literally rot their mind. They'll go crazy. At the same time, they'll probably more and more often be able to cough up blood and sneeze and just start losing control of some bodily functions. It's really disgusting, and it kind of like wastes you away. It's not a slow death. So for it to be used narratively, it's this haunting presence in a novel where you know it's going to happen to this person. And you know, so there's two parents, one who's a drunk and one who's going to lose her mind. You have three young kids from a different marriage that are there, and then you have Sonia, who's kind of literally giving herself for the cause of supporting these children. And like I said, pay attention to how she is impacted spiritually or morally, because she really isn't. And Raskolnikov at some point later in the novel really kind of recognizes that, and he's very intrigued about why she's not being impacted morally, because he thinks they're kind of the same at some point, because they're both doing things or did things that should impact them, and he's starting to feel that. And he looks at her as like, what's your secret? How do you do this and not be devastated really by it? Certainly the role of fate in the novel, and I've talked about that as already. There are a bunch of quotes here that I've kind of culled from the text. He suddenly felt with his whole being that he no longer had any freedom either of mind or of will, that everything had been suddenly and finally decided. I mean, there are clear moments like that in the narration that things don't seem to be even to be allowed to be decided upon by him. They feel like they have already been decided upon. As if someone had taken him by the hand and pulled him along irresistibly, blindly, with unnatural force, without objections. And that kind of creeps in here and there in the text as well, but it's something to pick up on about narration. And then dreams. We have this crazy dream. So let's talk about it. Because we get understandably hung up on the fact that there's this horrible scene of killing the mayor. But it's important to consider not only that moment, but the other parts of the dream, and what was the journey supposed to be, who was on it, where are they going. Those are all important things. So some things to notice here. So the directions to the dream, right, are the top paragraph on page 54. I mean, like I said, it feels like it's pulled out of a psychology textbook. In a morbid condition, dreams are often distinguished by their remarkably graphic, vivid, and extremely lifelike quality. The resulting picture is something monstrous, but the setting and the whole process of the presentation sometimes happen to be so probable and with details so subtle, unexpected, yet artistically consistent with the whole fullness of the picture, that even the dreamer himself would be unable to invent them in reality, though he were as much an artist as Pushkin or Turgenev. This kind of detached voice there in the narration. And then we get Raskolnikov had a terrible dream. And then there's a tense shift after that sentence. He dreamed of his childhood. He is about 7 years old, and it goes on, and the whole dream is in the present tense. Until page 59 when it ends. And interestingly enough, the end of the dream is "and wakes up" in the present tense. And then the next line, the next paragraph says, "he awoke." And we're back to the past tense, which is pretty typical of any kind of narration. I believe it's the only time in the novel where you have that tense shift. But what do you think? Why do it? Like, what does it do? Does it do anything?
It's just a little inconsistent from childhood.
Yeah, so I mean, just by its very nature, it makes it stick out. Sure. Yeah, Paige?
I think it makes it more in the now than the past tense does, so it's more in front of your face rather than kind of in the
Yeah, I think it kind of does lift it up in your face a little bit. So we know the terrible beating of the mayor. Why does that happen? Like, what's the plan? Who's in the dream at the beginning?
His father.
And him, right? So this is like the only time in the text his father has this presence. And what's their plan? Where are they going?
To a grave.
They're going to a grave. Remember who's?
It's like baby siblings who died at like 6 months old or whatever.
And so they go, and then they go and they have to go through town. They have to go through this section, and they kind of know that it's going to be not great. But then they run into this thing that's quite horrible. But it's interesting to think, and it's hard to do right now, not having read the text. But it's very much an analogy of the entire text in some ways. That Raskolnikov is on this, this quest, if we can think about it from Foster's standpoint in How to Read Literature, that he doesn't quite understand, right? That he doesn't really understand the ultimate reason for the quest. He has a stated reason. He's going to kill this person. He's going to test this theory, but there's something else at play here. And he ultimately gets to that place of spirituality, I think, represented in this story by the intent to go pay respects at a gravesite near the church. He ultimately gets there, but to get there, he needs to kind of go through this murder. In the dream, it's beating the mayor to death. In his life, it's killing Aliona, and then Lizaveta, kind of unplanned, but Lizaveta. And in some ways, this serves as this kind of underpinning for the text itself. And that idea, the next one here is about ownership versus morality, and that's kind of a heavy influence on the text, even in Mikolka, specifically saying, get your hands off my goods. These are my goods, as he beats his horse to death. I mean, probably the most vivid example of that. Hands off, it's my goods. I can do what I want, he says, over the mayor. Svidrigailov, in the story we get about him and Dunya, he kind of thinks he has kind of ownership over her because he works for her. Lucian perhaps has that over Dunya as well, the guy who kind of comes in to save her. Certainly Raskolnikov thinks he does, and he's irate about a couple things, but one is that he thinks Dunya's marrying for money and is going to be a pawn for this guy to kind of do whatever he wants with. And mimicked and mirrored immediately after having read that letter is this girl he runs into being kind of accosted in the park. And he is irate about this, and so much of it is this feeling I think he gets from this letter about protecting his own sister. But weirdly, he tries to help save her. I guess that's not weird. The weird part is then a couple pages later, he kind of totally turns the tables and says, whatever, do what you want with her, and he kind of gets really mad and goes away. Yeah.
I just think he kind of does that kind of thing a lot in the book, where he kind of makes kind of a drastic decision and then immediately regrets it, like when he leaves the money.
Yeah.
And then in this case where he's standing up, where he gives the guy money for carriage or whatever, and then he immediately regrets it. And then with the killing, he kind of immediately regrets it, kind of. So he kind of acts instinctually, but then he seems to change his mind pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. And just to give some of these some airtime, the other things that appear on this page, the overt discussion about the Übermensch theory, the Superman theory, really doesn't happen, I think, until part 3. But it has a place throughout the text, and even on page 51, it seemed to some of his friends that he looked upon them as children from above, as though he were ahead of them, all in development, in knowledge and in convictions, and that he regarded their convictions and interests as something inferior. It would be an example of how the theory is kind of manifest, I guess, in the text, even not discuss overtly in part 1. Still that question of liminal space, the place where boundaries dissolve a little and we stand there on the threshold getting ourselves ready to move across the limits of what we were into what we are to be. That's from a psychological standpoint. There's the physical places of space and bridges and door thresholds that kind of mimic all these other internal things going on with different characters. And illness as a symbolic internal force, illness as symbolic of internal forces under pressure is something to pay attention to. As Raskolnikov seems to get more unwound mentally, this kind of feverishness, sickness, physical illness is kind of raises its head more and more. And here on page 53, he's already feeling this physically. Some archetypal things, a couple of these I already talked about. We'll talk about 2 stories, one from the New Testament, one from the Old Testament. The book of Job is from the Old Testament. I'll tell you right now that it's kind of like the quintessential story about good versus evil, and it's battle over an individual. And in some ways, I think that is important to Crime and Punishment. And we'll look more at that story on a different day. It's a story from the New Testament. It's ultimately the last kind of miracle that Jesus had that kind of set everybody off. It was like, this guy's too freaking weird, we're going to kill him. And he raised Lazarus, there's his name. So it's the story of Lazarus. He literally raises Lazarus from the dead, and he raises Lazarus from the dead because he knows that Lazarus was a believer in him. So it is a kind of a message to everybody else, particularly after his death, to believe in me and you'll be resurrected, et cetera, et cetera. But this is the story of like the tipping point for everyone's like, you're too weird, you're too outside the box, you're trying to get people's attention a little too much, and we're gonna crucify you. And so it was this ultimate story that led to his death. Questions? Comments? That's a lot of me talking, but I think as we go through this novel, hopefully those rules will be reversed a lot more, and the things that you heard about today can be kind of, held on to. You can start to notice them for yourselves if you haven't already as we go through the other.